I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening to our formally initial lecture for the Center for Orthodox Thought and Culture. I say formally because last year we actually were blessed to have Father Justin Sinaites here from St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. You can see the whole YouTube either on Eastern's YouTube channel or Agora's channel. It's on Agora's channel? It's on Agora's channel. And of course, Agora is the parent of us at the Center for Orthodox Thought and Culture. That's why you have this big backdrop behind us. It also looks better for our film. But I am Professor Jenkins, Cyril Jenkins, or Gary Jenkins, and I'm at the moment the director for the Center for Orthodox Thought and Culture. I had told subdeacon Altomare, Dr. Altomare, that I'm really hesitant about starting anything to do with the Orthodox on time. Yes. So, I think if we just fast forwarded to the great entrance, then everyone will be here. But be that as it may. So tonight we're actually talking about something, that actually has resonance, even with Father Justin Sinaites, as we shall see. And the basis of our lecture, that is looking at the Shroud of Turin, when we think about this and we think about what is the purpose of education, because this is really what our center is about, and I think it comes up best in an incident that happened more than 1,200 years ago. I just used this anecdote Sunday in church, giving a lecture about stewardship. But about the year 790, two Irish monks showed up in northern Gaul, and they made their way to the fairs, to the villages, selling wisdom. And this is what they proclaimed: we are here to sell wisdom. Well, word of this got around, and sure enough, word got around so much that they were summoned before the court of the king at Aachen to a man named Karl. Most of the world remembers him as Charlemagne, but he was a German. His name was Karl. And he says, what is this that you're doing, selling wisdom? And they said, oh, our king, we're not selling wisdom. It just seems to be that people only value that for which they think they have to pay. Wisdom is something that's available for everyone. There's nothing elitist about it. And this is the purpose of education. It's not to get a better job. It's not to impress your friends at parties playing Trivial Pursuit. The purpose of education ultimately is wisdom, and this is what we're hoping to do with the Center for Orthodox Thought and Culture, is provide an education that is going to help our young people for the rest of their lives, not just learn a skill that is marketable at some time. So tonight we have Dr. Corrado Altomare. I've known him for some years, and for all those years, I've never realized that we have the same alma mater, which is Rutgers University. It's where he met his wife, Alfie, prior to him running off to Genoa to go to medical school, abandoning her, but ultimately marrying her halfway through the whole process. Corrado is a subdeacon at St. Gregory Palamas Orthodox Church in Glen Gardner. He was ordained by His Grace, Archbishop Michael, and he has been my friend for some years, and I am happy that he is my friend, because there's nothing I think that I can't talk to him about. There's nothing I think he doesn't know about. And therefore, I am happy that he's here tonight to talk about something, and I shall let him do the introductions about his interaction with the Shroud of Turin. So, Corrado.
This is about education, but really it's more about my journey of faith over the many years of having engaged with the Holy Shroud of Turin. Introduction myself, I'm a zoologist. My undergrad degree at Rutgers, as Gary mentioned, and then I went to medical school, was going to be a surgeon and decided to become a gynecologist, and I practiced gynecology for 25 years. But all along my path, I always kept Christ's face in mind. So my first experience with having visited the Shroud was in the 1970s, and I'll show you as we go along those pictures from back then. And I walked away with a sense of total awe, not really knowing what to expect at that point in my life, and really not understanding, is the Shroud a relic? Is it art? Is it forgery? Is it real? It always tempted. Of course, looking at the face of Christ in our icons, I couldn't but walk away and understand really the message behind the Shroud. So what I hope to do today is to really walk you through this, my journey, show you what we read on the Shroud, Christ's passion and crucifixion, and his resurrection, but also how this has influenced Orthodox iconography and our liturgy to some degree. My wife tells me I have too many slides, so I'll need to keep it short. But I really want to go through the first part with you in much more detail. And later on, if we're out of time, I can speed up. What time do we have to?
2 in the morning.
2 in the morning? Okay. Okay.
Maybe that's just me.
I didn't make up this title of the Face of God. Actually, this has been the title of many passages and many tracts that were written about the Shroud over many, many years. But to me, it becomes much more personal. I'm going to try to show you what I view in this. And I stand here not representing any particular church. This is my lecture. I'm not being sponsored by anyone. I have no disclosures. And really, this is something that if you do have questions, I would like to hear them. So I will stop after the various parts of the presentation to try to clarify for you. So, ecce homo, as they say in Latin, here's the man. And this is the picture that probably most of you are familiar with. This is not what you see on the Shroud. This is actually a negative plate of the face of the Shroud. And the marks that you see on here, I'm going to walk you through this and how to read this. So for instance, these lines here, these are creases in the cloth. Okay, they're artifact, really. This is the face, and then you see high white light areas, and that represents secretions in blood in this case. So this is the Shroud as when it is exposed. This is really what you see. It's this color. It's a sepia color, a lot of white. The colors here are enhanced. The photography has been enhanced so that you can make out the image a lot better. This is a negative. And if you pay attention to the features, just closely, if you focus on the face particularly, you will see that this looks more like a photo than this does of the image. And this is, so for the supposed 1900 years that the Shroud existed, no one ever saw Christ's face looking like this on the Shroud, because photography didn't exist until more recently. So what I'd like to do with you right now at this point is to take you some of the forensics of the Shroud. There's a lot of distracting items on here, and I'm going to explain what they are. They weren't here from the beginning of Shroud's history. These burn marks date from the 1500s. So how prelates and people, the faithful, when they came to venerate the Shroud, they didn't have a lot of this distraction. So we're going to try to peel back some of this for you. So these are just some line drawings of really what a burial could have been like back in those days in Palestine. And obviously here to represent what the previous picture looks like, it's a cloth. And it gets folded over the body. The back and the front would leave some kind of impression of body secretions, blood, etc. Typical tomb of that era, roll-away stone. We know that from our Paschal hymns. And of course, as you enter into the cubicle itself, there would be maybe something that looked like this, or even like this. Bottom laid with sand, the body would be laid on it. It would help with absorbing body fluids in the decomposition of the body. And obviously what was normally done back in those days as it is today in many parts of the world, is that when a body's totally decomposed, you collect the bones and put them in an ossuary. So that was what was anticipated with the body of Christ. So why my story begins here? Well, it began back in 1978, when after a very long period of time, there was a public exposition of the Shroud. This was to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Shroud coming to Torino, or to Turin. Before that, it was over the Alps in Savoy, which is now part of France. So when I was living in Italy at the time, and my cousin, who was a priest, said, they're going to have an exhibition of the Shroud. Let's go. Sure, let's go. It was a 2.5-hour ride by train for me. So we went there, we got there, we waited on lines forever to get in. And you can only imagine, in typical Italian style, it's not very orderly. But once you're in the church, you're pushed along, and you have a very short period of time to actually stand in front and try your eyes to collect the light so that you can actually see the face, because it's really the thing that stands out. I wasn't satisfied with that visit, so 2 weeks later I went back. And this time I acted like a typical Italian. I pushed my way in the back each and every time they pushed me in front, so this way I can stay in front of the Shroud. So I had my dollar's worth out of that visit. But the reality was I wanted to stand there and pray. It just moved me so much. And I was not able to do it, just given the logistics of the crowd. So at the end of this period, this was the public exhibition time from August 27th to October 8th. After that, the Shroud went under significant days of scrutiny, study, photography, cutting away of fibers, etc. And we'll try to cover some of this. So when I went, I didn't know what to expect as far as my first visit. Was there going to be a crowd like this? Was there going to be, 5 bishops standing there holding it? And actually, this is actually a line drawing from the 1898 exposition of the Shroud. It was this exhibition at which the first photograph was taken of the Shroud. And these bishops, if you look in some of the textbooks, they're all named, they know who they are. And this was to celebrate the wedding of Clotilda, who was actually the daughter of the King of Savoy, at the time, King of Italy. And she was so obsessed with how the Shroud was treated that she wouldn't allow bright lights. She didn't want candles or incense near it, because then it was not covered in a glass case. It was exposed to nature. And there was a kind of a dilettante photographer by the name of Secondo Pia, who she liked, and she said, I want you to take a photo. And I'll show you a little on what that looked like. But here again, just to contrast the sepia natural light, again, photo enhanced so that you can see it a little darker, and here's the negative. And you could clearly see that this face looks more natural than this face. Many of you here probably are too young to remember what it was like to take photographs with an old films. And you would take them out of the roll when they were developed, and you look at them, and everybody looked ugly on it because everything was inverse proportion. What should be dark was now light, et cetera, et cetera. You couldn't make out facial features. It was really disturbing to look at those. And of course, when you got it developed, the picture looked totally normal. But this is really the negative of a photograph, if you would. This is the positive. So this is what happened in 1978. This is in Turin's palace, the royal palace, which is where the studies were conducted. And Sturp, or the Shroud of Turin Research Project, was again, the first time that a group of scientists of all walks of life came together to put their heads together in their various science backgrounds to say, what is it? We need to find out. How did this image get here? We need to find out. Up till then, don't forget, this wasn't exhibited to public. It was very private because it was in the possession of the King of Italy. And there weren't any scientific studies done. And the first photograph, like I said, was in 1898. So there was a lot to learn. This is the cathedral itself of St. John the Baptist. And the back part of this church is where this giant dome, the Guerini Dome, which actually the Shroud was housed in. So there were royal tombs in the back there as well. But this is on a nice day. When there was the exhibit, it was just mobbed with people with zigzagging lines. So when you walk in, this is what you actually saw in an encasement. And this is actually the full length of the shroud. It's 14, 3 inches by 7 feet wide. But in first century commercial units, it's 8 cubits by 2 cubits. So it was a real measurement that that you would have made cloths of in those days, one of the many measurements. So, because this is an odd length, right? If you would think you would have like a 10 by 12 sheet or something like that. But this is actually a normal measuring cloth back in the first century. Now, people say, so what's it made of? Well, it's made of linen. And it's a herringbone type of weave. And you can see the schematics here just so that you know what herringbone is. Really, I'm not into fabric, so when somebody says herringbone, I have to think really what that means. It's the type of weave that you have. And here's an actual picture of the shroud, and this is with actually parts of the shroud that have blood stain on it. So it looks pretty dark. Other parts of the shroud would look very light. You wouldn't see even a sepia color. And so here again, you see the weave, and here are blood-stained areas. And you can see the rest is fairly white. A lot of this language doesn't mean much to us, like, for instance, like the Z-twist, et cetera, et cetera. If anybody's into this, they would understand that better. But nonetheless, this type of fabric was very expensive back in first century of that millennium. This was not the average cloth that somebody would have around the house. This was expensive. It had to have been bought either in for merchants that were dealing with rather wealthy clients. And it's even thought that this type of weave was not as extensively made throughout the Mediterranean basin, and a lot of it may have actually come from India. Again, it's conjecture as to where it came from, but this would have not been your average house type of cloth. So we have to keep that into consideration as to why this particular cloth, this expensive cloth, would have been used for a burial cloth. Think of Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea. Who are they? What did they do? So Joseph of Arimathea particularly was a fairly wealthy guy. And he was responsible for taking Christ's body down from the cross. So maybe it was his. Maybe it was his purchase. We don't know. We can skip that. Now, as I said earlier, there were a lot of distractions on the shroud. And this is taken, a photograph taken with a really heavy-duty light from behind it. And so pretty much all of the image fades out. But what you're left with are these irregular markings here. These are burns into the cloth. Okay, so this is missing fabric here. What you see white is actually missing fabric. And you'll see holes like this. You see these 3 holes here. And that one that looks like an L sitting on its side. These did not occur at the same time as these burns. And we're going to show you why we know that even. So you have burn holes, you have scorching, you have water stains, you have patches, and you have a complex weave. Now here, you see these markings? Are these clear here? They're diamond shape. These are water stains that were left there from the fire at Chambéry in the 1500s. And obviously they tried to extinguish the fire, and so they doused the casket that the shroud was in with water, and it left a stain on it. Again, this distracts you from the figure or the image when you look at it, because you're seeing all this other stuff running into each other, and it's very difficult to actually visualize. So all of the markings, I kind of mentioned it. You have areas of the linen which are clean. You have burn and scorch marks. You have water stains. You have blood stains. You have banding phenomenon. I'm going to show you something about that later. That's really important. And there's dirt, there's wrinkles and folds, and then you have patches of cloth that were then sewn into those burnt out areas by the Poor Clare nuns about 2 years after the Chambéry fire. And they did it to protect the cloth. And they sewed on the back of it something called a Holland cloth, which was another piece of linen, but it was meant to support so that when they rolled it up, it was always kept rolled up. And they wanted to make sure in the rolling process that you weren't over creasing it, because that's why we have some of those folds, and they felt that was a protection as well. So the faint image, you see, now to orient you to the image itself, here, this is natural light. This is what you would normally see with your eye. Here's enhanced. And you see, obviously, there's a front of an individual, because you see the face, and you see kind of a chest. see arms crossed over the inguinal region, and you see legs. On the back, you see the back of the head here. We're going to have some close-ups, so don't try to stress on this one. But the back is less obvious because there aren't too many distinguishing parts other than what you see as what seems to be slashes in the flesh. Now, the shroud has gone through a very turbulent history for many reasons. This is one of the last ones. This was a fire in 1997, which this fireman here single-handedly went into a burning church, which the dome was thought to collapse almost. He went in by himself with a hatchet, broke the glass case that this casket was held in, and dragged it out and dragged it through the entire church. He risked his life to do this. He was honored, as you can only imagine, for having done this, but this was the last time the shroud was in real significant danger of fire. And it was from this point onwards that it was decided not to keep the shroud rolled up any longer, but it was to be kept laid out flat in a glass case that would contain gas to protect it from deterioration and corrosion, as well as humidity, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these are the holes I was speaking of before, the little holes. They're called poker holes because it was thought that back in the day, somebody wanted to test to see if it was real, it wouldn't burn. We don't know. That's a hypothesis. But there were other reasons to believe that that may have been the case, simply because the shroud back in the way these burns appear was folded up only in 4 pieces. After that, it had been folded up in like 32 folds. So, and then after that, it was in a roll form. So it was various ways. So over the centuries, it's been folded in many ways possible. And why we know that these burns antecede or were before the Chambéry fire is because of this there was a Pry Codex, which dates from 1192 to 95, and it's a precious volume which is held in the National Library in Budapest. And this is part of the Pry Codex, in which the shroud, or a burial cloth, it's not even viewed as the shroud, it's just showing you a cloth that was going to be folded over Christ. And you could see it had these markings in it. Very strange markings. Why would an artist put it in there if he really wasn't copying it from something? And so this is the first evidence that these holes were here way before the fire in Chambéry. So that was before it left Constantinople, before it went missing, put it that way. And so anytime after that, when you see depictions of the shroud after the Chambéry fire, you'll always see it with the burn marks in it throughout, right? Like we saw it up front, what you see today. If this is the burial cloth of Christ, well, obviously it's from Jerusalem. The story goes that it went to Edessa, to King Abgar, then to Constantinople, and then somehow wound up in Lirey, France. And this is where we have the first information of the shroud after it left Constantinople. And there's a gap of time in here from 1204 to 1353. And that's a piece of the puzzle I'm going to try to put together for you. So here, these are the previous burns that from the Pry Codex, and then the yellow, all these burns here are from the Chambéry fire. So you have 2 different sets of burns that kind of distort the image for us. And that's just repeating it. So this was now showing you a depiction of what the shroud looked like in 1578. And you could see the burn marks here with the patches, those triangular-looking patches. So we know that, at least at that point in history, it's documented, those burns were there, and it's got to be the same piece of cloth that they had in Chambéry in that fire. So this is where I come into the story, because this is how it looked like back in 78. You have your typical carabinieri standing there, and you have people rushing by, and you're standing at a significant distance, and the lighting, there's a glass covering on it, and so there was reflection. People were taking photographs. It was just very difficult to really stay and gaze. If you get too close to the shroud, it all kind of disappears on you, kind of goes out of focus. You have to be about 8 to 10 feet away to really start, once your eyes kind of accommodate the lighting in the room, that you can really start to see it. So that's kind of an interesting fact, that there's not been a lot written about that, And it's quite interesting as to why that's the case, because one would expect if this were a painting, this were a forgery, you would expect to see imprint or painting better when you're closer up than when you're further away. So there's a lot of story that is being developed around this fact. And again, you can see here how the lighting is irregular. It distorts it, so whenever you're in its presence, it's really hard to view it. Now here is when they took it out of the frame and they were going to start the studies, and the steward was going to do the studies. And you can only imagine the angst of the custodians of the shroud allowing scientists to handle this. Not only were they going to handle it, but they were going to cut pieces of cloth out of it as well. And so there was a lot of anxiety around this. Should they do it? Should they not do it? Should they do it? Should they not do it? Well, they had to do it. The church had committed at that point that they were going to go ahead and allow the scientists to do it, but it took a lot of head wrangling. Ray Rogers, he's from Los Alamos. He was actually the very first person to look at the back of the shroud by unsewing the cloth that was its backing. It's no longer the original Holland cloth, but it was another cloth. It was a satin cloth that Clotilde, the princess, had sewn on there because she felt the white cloth just didn't do it. It wasn't dignified enough. So nonetheless, when they did take the backing off, no one ever saw the backside of the cloth. What they were amazed to find is that there's no image on it. The only thing that you can see on the backside are bloodstains. You can't see any other image. You can see the burns, obviously, but there was nothing else, no other telltale signs. So that was an interesting find at that point. This is John Jackson. He too doing it, and most of these were Americans, and they were scientists, some NASA scientists, some of them physicists. They were just people from all walks of life who had a keen interest in trying to figure what this was all about. So here I just put some dates up as this is modern research that's been done. So the first colored photography, for instance, was in '69. I mentioned earlier 1889 was actually, 1898 rather, was the first photograph, but it wasn't in color. So this is the first color photograph. For the first time it was ever shown on TV in '73. In '76, John Jackson and Morton view for the first time the 3D imaging of photography that was taken. And you have to see these pictures. They're absolutely amazing. In '78, there was a public exhibition, and it was taken back to the Royal Palace, and that's when they did all the studies we're talking about. And in '83, the exiled king of Italy, who was in Cascais, Portugal, died. And in his will, he left it to the Pope and his successors. They were to be the custodians, but it was never to leave Torino. He didn't want it to go to Rome. He wanted it to stay in Torino because that was the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. And so this is the first time it leaves the hands of the House of Savoy since it was given to them. And then in '98 was the public exposition to commemorate the centenary discovery of Secondo Pia, of the first photograph. And it was at this workshop, this forensic workshop, that I participated at. And to tell you, that was the most humbling experience of my life. So these are random pictures of what it looked like in '78 when they were doing various studies. It was just an amazing feat, the amount of time and equipment. And the equipment, speaking of equipment, there was a little sidebar that I read not too long ago that when Sturp was sending its equipment over, the Italian customs held it, refused to let it go through. And so it took some wrangling and probably bribing to get it released. But nonetheless, they had their equipment at the end of the day. Now here I am, believe it or not, that's me, chunky-headed guy there. This is Michele Salcito. He's written tons on the shroud, and he's done lots of research. He's a physician like myself, but then he dedicated his whole career to the forensics of the shroud and has worked with these teams forever, and he's still doing well. And here is Michele passing by the shroud. So this was when we had our private viewing the night that we had our Congress. And so this is the actual photograph of Secondo Pia. So this was his negative. And this is the gentleman who actually took the photograph with this camera. You can only imagine the type of flash that they tried to use, the big sulfur bursts, et cetera, which was why the princess was so concerned. So she refused to have him do it at first when she saw what that would entailed. And then when he took 2 plates, one with a 14-minute exposure and the second one with a 20-minute exposure, around midnight. He took the plates to his studio, chemical development, and this is what he said. Closed up in my dark room, I experienced such an intense emotion when I saw for the first time the holy face appear on the plate with such clearness that I remained as if frozen. It was so much so that he almost dropped the plates and broke them. But he couldn't believe what he was seeing when they started to develop, that he was seeing something that you could not see by just looking at the shroud with your bare eyes. And so this is what you'd see with your bare eyes, and this is what the negative looks like. And you can see it's an incredible difference, and you got to say, why is that? So is whatever mechanism left this imprint on the shroud like a photographic method of some sort? Who knows? There's no answer to this. So I just bring it up, and this was the first photo that he signed. So it's a photographic negative. Clearer pictures are noted. Obviously, you can see it much clearer at this point. Something about the height of the person depicted in the shroud, anywhere from 5'7" to 5'11". You say, why is that? How can there be such discrepancy in measurements? Well, there's a lot of argument on really what this means, because a body in rigor mortis, sometimes the legs are going to be poked up a little bit. So they're not sure what this person would be if we were able to push the legs down and measure full length. So it's somewhere in there. Right? That's what they're getting out of this. So now here is the second secondopia. His name is Barry Schwartz, a devout Jew who went on the 78 mission as the official photographer for Sturp. Since that day, he's never left the side of the shroud. It's amazing. He has the best website you can ever want, and actually I recommend going on that website. I have it later in my suggested reading. But he has done more to advance the science of the shroud than any one other single individual in that crowd. And I had breakfast with him one morning in Torino, and he's a simple guy, typical Californian, laid back. And I didn't know him from a hole in the wall. And I said, well, who are you? And he said, I'm Barry Schwartz. I'm taking pictures. And wow. Well, I've had a few conversations with him ever since then. But it's amazing. It's changed his life. And you can see why. So this is him back then in the 70s. Now this is a 3D imaging done with something called a VP8 image analyzer. Don't ask me how that works. But it is an interesting tool that John Jackson, et cetera, has done, Los Alamos Labs. They've done a lot of work on this. And it was the first time that we're able to actually get something that looks like a 3D image from a flat surface that we don't know how it got there. You don't get it from painting, and you don't get it from a photograph, but you get it from this particular image. And if they did the whole body scan, you'd see how there's a relief. So this is actually made out of cardboard, and it's point by point. It's like looking at pixels one at a time. And this is generated from that imaging there. And here again, I think this to me is really a phenomenon. But the ones with the crossed hands are really incredible. Now, obviously, what looks red here is color enhanced to show where actually the blood marks are on the arms. But this type of imaging is just astounding. And again, they're not really sure why this particular linen, an image imprinted on it, can have a 3D image form on top of it. So there's a lot to be said about this. It's really not the topic of my discussion because this is a science that I'm really removed from. Like I said, a zoologist, surgeon, gynecologist, so I'm more into the blood and guts more than anything else, not the imaging method. So anyway, I wanted to do forensics on this. So really, what do we mean by that? It's obviously the application of scientific knowledge to legal problems, especially scientific analysis of physical evidence. So we have the Gospels to work with. And so if the shroud is authentic, then the Gospel stories and the shroud need to corroborate at some point. So what do we know from the gospel? Well, we have several things we can point out. We have Christ was beaten, he was scourged, he was crowned with thorns, carried the cross, nailed to the cross, died on the cross, his side was pierced, and then he was buried. So we're going to try to use these points from the gospel to see, do we see this on the shroud? So he was beaten, and it says here in Luke, they struck him on the face. Now, there's been a lot said about why some sides look darker than others. And the image shows up darker the closer it was to the cloth. So if you were to envision laying a handkerchief over your face, what would show up the darkest, if it were to take an imprint of your face, would be like your nose, etc., your lips, if they protruded, etc., anything that protrudes forward. And anything that is lower and maybe not so much in direct contact with the cloth would show up lighter. So obviously, what the thought is here, especially with this, is that this is tumefaction, this is swelling of the soft tissue. From either this point of the Passion of Christ or from any other time throughout the Passion where he fell, where we don't know what really happened, but there was a lot of distortion of the facial features, obviously due to the beating. We come to probably the most cruel invention of the Romans, the flagrum, flagellation. So in the gospel it says, I will have him flogged and chastise him and let him go. And this is just, again, just from one gospel. So we know that Christ was flogged. And sorry for these numbers here, couldn't get rid of them, but you see all these white stripes that kind of are whole throughout here? That's thought to be excoriated flesh, skin. And the same thing appears on the front, except for the blood marks, of course. So this here is shroud-like image highlighted. These dark areas are highlighted to show you where on the shroud you can find what looks like the effect of flagellation. The flagellum or the flagrum consisted of leather bands on a rod, and at the end they had either lead pieces or small bones from sheep. And obviously when you were hit with it, the lead balls would cause ecchymosis, it would cause swelling, it would cause bruising, and the sheep bones would cause laceration. So the combination of both of them together would basically tear your skin off. Now, according to Jewish law, a flagellation consisted of 40 minus 1, 39. They count about 120 if you use the science here. But if you look at the flagellum, one lictor or one soldier doing the flagellation could have had multiple leather bands on each piece. So every time you were hit with it, you may have been hit with 9 or 10 at a time from each side. And this depiction here is really not as accurate. Usually the person being flagellated was tied higher on a column and basically sink to their feet, sink to their knees rather, and 2 soldiers would be one on each side in the back and would alternate, hitting, until they counted to 39. Now, this was a form of punishment used on non-Romans. The only Roman who would get flagellated would have been a soldier who deserted the army. Women were not flagellated, neither were children. But any foreigner, any seditionist, that would be step 1 in your torture before you were killed. So flagellation was a horrible form, and it basically, you could be exsanguinated from this if they didn't stop early enough. They did make sure, though, that they would never get whipped in the chest, in the front, because strong blows to your chest can give you cardiac arrest, and you would die, and then they wouldn't have any more fun torturing you. So it was forbidden to hit anyone in the chest with these things. So it became something, and it was really up to the individual soldiers on how cruelly to treat you. And we know from the Gospels They mocked him, they laughed at him, they spit on him, etc. They had a vendetta with him. For all we know, they could have been paid by the Sanhedrin to kind of really give it to this guy. We can only imagine what it was like and what they did, but it seems that the amount of flagellation done on this person was more than would have been allowed by law. This is a statue made by Giulio Ricci, and he took it from the Shroud. And he basically tried to correlate the marks on the Shroud with what it would look like on the flesh if you were to depict it. And it's a chilling statue to look at. So again, this amount of lashes from each soldier was only number 6. You had 33 to go. So you can only imagine how much flesh was exposed, how much blood is lost. And it's been said, and you read this not only just for the case of Jesus, but in flagellation in general, from general history, Roman history, is that many people died of hypovolemic shock as a result of this before they ever got to be crucified or whatever else was going to be done with them. So this again, the red marks are just kind of enhancing, they're just color enhancing of the areas on the body. So it really went down to the legs, the backs of the thighs, et cetera, et cetera. No part was spared. This is what the flagellum looks like. A lot of these things are recreated from archaeological finds throughout the Roman world of the day. And the plumbate are the lead pieces, and then of course you had small bones that you can see here. So, and interestingly enough, the lead look like little dumbbells actually, bars. Yeah. The size of these actually fit into what we see on the Shroud. So that's kind of an interesting correlation there. And this is Ricci's statue again, and showing you the back on the Shroud, photo enhanced to this. Now, after that, what did they do with him? They put a purple robe on him, sat him down, they mocked him, and then they put a crown of thorns on him. So this corroborates, obviously, with Gospels, and these are various depictions that you can find about what it could have looked like, should have looked like, obviously, what we're seeing on the Shroud face, though, these like backwards 3 and these big white marks here are really flow of blood from the scalp. Now, anybody here, if you've ever seen a little kid that ever fell and kind of broke the skin on their head, it bleeds like a Dickens. It's one of the most vascular pieces of your body, and it takes a lot to get the bleeding to stop, actually, in little children, and so sometimes they need stitches. So when you pierce the scalp, not just on a child, obviously on an adult, you get a lot of bleeding. These are the type of thorn bushes that you'd find kind of native to the Middle East. And there's one piece of science that we get from this too, is Max Frey, who is a criminologist, pollen specialist. He, in 1973, was allowed to take 12 adhesive tape, was allowed to take samples from different parts of the Shroud, the back and the front, to collect pollen, dust, mites, anything that you can find on it, and analyze it. And he came up with a bunch of different pollens, all of which are native to the Middle East area, to Anatolia, to Europe. So all the different places that the Shroud may have visited on its way to where it is today. This is just a digression. He did find that there were about 29 different species that were found there. This is one of his comments. I leave the possibility open that a part of the pollen comes from the manufacture of the cloth and perhaps from aromatic substances such as aloe used for the burial process, or from wet skin of the body which was wrapped in the cloth. He really wasn't saying what his thoughts were, more just to say, this is what I found, this is where it's from, and potentially can fit the picture. But this was more typical of what a crown of thorns would have looked like. Instead of the usual wreath that you see, an open wreath, it would have been a basket-shaped thing, and it would be placed on your head. And what did they do then? They hit him with a rod. Remember? It says in the Gospel, they hit him on a rod. Those thorns were sticking deep into the scalp. And this is, again, a picture showing what that basket look would have been on someone's head. And again, to highlight the blood areas from the scalp. This type of photography, which is an enhancement just to show what we would think be hot spots, but really it's to show blood spots. Now, the Via Crucis. This is what everybody thinks of. Christ carrying his cross. He carries the whole thing. Well, it really wasn't that way. But from the gospel, we know he carried the cross himself. It doesn't say what the cross looked like. And the trajectory of needing to carry the cross, where did it go from? Well, it went from the fortress of Antonia out to Golgotha, which, if they have the archaeological digs correct in today, looking at Jerusalem the way it's today, and if we believe that Golgotha is where it is, that was the real place of crucifixion, etc., it was going to be just about a mile. That's a long distance for anybody who's been tortured, flagellated, then have to carry a cross. If we think of the patibulum, which would have been the arm piece, right, the cross beam, could have weighed anywhere from 75 to 150 pounds, just that piece alone. So that's why who was recruited to then carry the cross? Simon. Right, Simon of Cyrene, because Jesus just couldn't do it. Obviously, he was tortured by flagellation. Think about it. You step back a little bit. Think of your Gospels. There's the supper in the upper room. Goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Stays there late, gets arrested, gets brought then to the various courts that he had to go through. He spent an entire night going through this process, probably dehydrated, tired, and then gets flagellated and loses tons of liquid, blood, serum, etc. There's no way any human, no matter how strong you are going to be able to carry a 100-pound piece of wood on your back after all of that. So just think of what it takes to even, we read the Gospels and sometimes we don't picture in our minds, we look at our beautiful icons, we look at the cross, but we don't think what that was really like. Thank God we don't concentrate on that because it's very scary. So there were many types of crosses. And obviously, these are just pictures of the cross. This is the Tau cross. This is most likely what was used in the Palestine area, okay, of all the crosses there. And it was easy to get the patibulum, or the cross arm, and hoist it up to the stipes, which is the upright version. It was easy for the soldiers to do that. And it didn't have to be high off the ground. It just had to be high enough so that the feet of the individual could still be secured to the bottom of the post. The rest of these type of crosses, this is a very primitive version here. It's probably more this than anything else. And the position that a body would have to lay on it depended on the shape of the cross, the length of the individual, and the length of the cross. Crucifixion, by the way, was not invented by the Romans, but it was invented by the Persians. Alexander the Great introduced it to Carthage and to North Africa. The Romans perfected the art. They didn't invent it. And when I say perfected, because they knew what it would take to kill somebody on the cross, how long it would take you to die, especially if you didn't get flagellated beforehand. I'll go through that in a sec. So here is typical of what somebody would have been like carrying just a patibulum. Usually your arms were tied to it, and you carried it on your back, and when you got to the place of the actual crucifixion, you were thrown on the floor, and then you would be secured to it with nails. This sedile was something that came later in the crucifixion history. It's a seat, basically, that would allow the crucified individual to rest his buttocks on it, so this way you can last longer. It was a crueler addition to just hanging. So from the shroud, they see much deeper, much more tumefied areas across the back like this, and it's thought maybe that represents carrying the patibulum. Not sure. Again, this is what a thought is, but obviously no one can verify this, but it's a thought knowing on how the carrying of the cross, what it consisted of. Of course, getting fixed to the cross then was another story. In Persia and in some other areas, you were just tied there, not nailed. And when you died, they would let the vultures just eat you away. The Romans used this to fix you. And they actually, they have recovered nails, obviously, archaeologically, and there can be anywhere from 5 to 7 inches in length. It's a scary thought because they were pretty big. So we know from the Gospels he was crucified. And this is typical what we see in the films. We see him tied. And we see this one here tied, but he has nails through the hand. In this depiction is nails through the wrist. And everybody always thinks, well, it's always through the hands, obviously, because that's what we always see. But obviously, that was probably not the case, and the shroud doesn't demonstrate that either, because if you look here at the blood marks, this is from the wrist, not from the hands. One thing I want to show you here, this is an interesting picture. How many fingers do you count on each hand? Just 4. Now, there's a reason for that. But does anyone here believe that a medieval artist, if he were painting this, would show Christ's hands with just 4 fingers? Not knowing what severing the median nerve would do. So we have to take that into consideration when we're analyzing this. So when you get nailed through the hand itself, there's really not a whole lot of structure there that can prevent the hand from ripping through the nail as you're hanging and your weight is suspended on it. But there are spots in the metacarpals. It's against the radius and the small bones, right here. Strong tendon that runs across this way. People that get tendonitis and carpal tunnel and all that stuff know that area very well. Put the nail right there. It doesn't pierce any major vessels either, so you don't bleed out of it very much. But you do sever the median nerve. And when you sever the median nerve, besides the excruciating pain that you get from severing a nerve, you get contraction of your thumb. And you get a claw-like presentation of the rest of the hand. But the thumb is retractable at that point. You can't abduct it anymore. And so it explains to some degree that probably that nerve was injured, cut, lacerated in the crucifixion where the way the nail was put in to allow this to happen, because even in rigor mortis, you're not going to be able to undo that contraction. So this is somewhat of a schematic showing what would happen if a nail went through that particular spot. And this measurement here of a nail was actually taken from what I mentioned, the archaeological finds. We know that that's what the measurements were, more or less. So here we go again, just showing you what it could be like. And this is kind of to show you what a contracture would look like. Now, when you were fixed to the cross with nails, whether it was your hands or your feet, no major vessels are pierced. So you don't bleed out. And again, that was part of the Roman torture process. We don't want you to bleed out right away. We want you to hang there for a long time. There have been reports from ancient history that some people hung alive for 36 hours. Right? Now, besides the blood stain that you see up on the wrist area, you see these other dark areas, and obviously it accounts for the way the blood was dripping down. You weren't nailed tautly like this. You were given wiggle room so that you can push yourself up and down to breathe. Because if you were suspended there, once your intercostal muscles went into spasm, you weren't able to inhale or exhale any longer. So the idea was to give you the mechanics, the ergodynamics, to allow you to breathe for as long as you could. So this crucifix here is just showing what it was like to be able to shift and move, but you're pivoting on your wrist with your nails. Now, similarly with the feet, 2 feet, one on each other, think about it, the wood of the cross, it's hard to flex your feet backwards like that. The only way you can do that is by bending your knee. So the knees had to have been flexed in order to accomplish that. And this is part of the shroud. This is the backside of the shroud. This is the area of the feet. So you see, this is the foot that was most proximate to the wood of the cross. This one was the one that was probably on top of it. But laying the body out, they separated them because probably they were stiffened in rigor mortis. So you don't see the toe area as well, which would have had blood on it. And this is, again, just a schematic showing you where through the metatarsals it could have happened. So some of these can be very gory. I hope it's not upsetting anybody. But this red area here is highlighting the blood stains on the shroud in reference to where the feet would have been. So now Jesus dies on the cross, and we know that for a fact. And of course, there are a lot of people who say he didn't die on the cross. He was taken down by his friends, and he just walked away the next day, right? There are a lot of theories, believe me, and you read such silly stuff, and you got to say honestly. But he did die, and we know he died. Because when you're hanging like this on a cross, in order to breathe, you need to push up on the nail that's in your feet to push your body up so you can exhale. And then you have to go back down again to inhale. So probably respirations were very shallow at best, and you would get significant contractions of all the muscles in the rib cage area that would if you ever had a Charlie horse in your leg, you know how painful that can be, and that's just on one leg. You can imagine that happening throughout your whole chest wall, because that's what this would really lead to. So you have hypercapnia, in other words, your CO2 in your body really went up significantly. You had not only loss of blood, but you had a loss of nutrients, sodium, calcium, etc. So it caused lots of things. So probably the death of somebody on the cross like this would have happened through hypovolemia or volume of fluid loss, as well as asphyxia. The two most probable causes of death of anyone crucified. So, why was the lance used in the side? Well, they had two ways of making sure you were dead. First of all, they needed to expedite the death on this day because the two thieves had their legs broken. When you break somebody's legs, they can no longer push up and down. So they'll asphyxiate much quicker. They got to Christ, said he was dead. But no soldier was going to walk away from that scene and say he wasn't sure he was dead. So this is the typical lancea. This is actual real reproduction of an archaeologic find. Here's a statue showing the right side incision with the lance. And we lose visuals here because of this burn patch, but you see this cluster of blood here. This is the right side. Don't forget, everything is inversed, left, right, because the cloth is over you, turn it around, that makes left to right. So don't be confused with what you see in the statue here with the incision here, but it's the opposite side on the shroud. This is the back of the cloth, and this is the other side of this. That's here. So you could see how the blood flowed when the body was reclined flat. The blood flowed and sank to the back, to the small of the back. The other thing that is mentioned, though, in the Gospels is that there was a flow of water and blood. And that makes a lot of sense. Somebody who is in hypovolemic shock winds up collecting a lot of fluid around the pericardium or the sac around the heart, as well as the pleura around the lungs. When you put a lance through the rib cage, opposite from where the heart sits, from this side, what comes out first is water. Basically, it's the fluid that's been accumulated into the chest cavity and around the heart, and then it would be followed by blood. There's even some talk, and I know Pierre Barbet, who wrote a wonderful book called The Doctor of Calvary in the 1930s, he wrote that also people who undergo torture such as this can also have something called a rupture of the heart, because Christ seems to suddenly give up his spirit in the gospel. He says about 7 words, and then cries out, and everybody knew he was dead. So he died quickly on the cross compared to what most subjects would have been in this type of torture. And again, the mere fact that he didn't need to have his legs broken to die quickly stood to the fact that he was already dead. But the soldiers needed to do this simply because they were not going to be held responsible for a guy who was alive still, and they were taking the bodies down because it was the Sabbath. They needed to get rid of this situation right away. So here's a schematic of what the lance going through the chest could be. This here is just the blood. Believe it or not, there have been studies on the blood areas, blood stains are there, and they were actually able to take a blood typing. I'm not saying that this is Jesus' blood type, I'm just saying this is what they found on the shroud. We don't know. It could be blood from anybody. This cloth has been around for 2,000 years and exposed to hundreds of thousands of people, so it could be anything. And again, this is a schematic. And I want to point out that these drawings here were published in none other than the JAMA, the Journal of American Medicine. It's a prestigious journal to have a publication put in. And when I found that article, I said, whoa, I can't get some of my articles in JAMA. How the heck did this get in? Because this is not a clinical study. But what it is, this is a group of individuals, theologians, scientists, anatomists, who felt it important to really show the world what crucifixion was like. Whether you want to put Jesus in that frame or not is indifferent. The reality is that crucifixion occurred as a way of torture and eliminating the enemy and setting example. Do you believe anybody in this room, if you saw somebody flagellated, you would want to do anything that guy did? No. So it was a mode of intimidation, first and foremost, and as well as getting rid of the individual who you're calling a criminal. So we know he was buried. Joseph, Arimathea, bought a linen cloth, taking it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb. We know that happened. And here is the paper I was just quoting from JAMA. This is from 1986. And basically gives you the idea of the cause of death. This is just the abstract of the paper. So this is really the forensics that I laid out for you. Of course, I can get into this because I'm an anatomist, right? And I know for many of you probably squirming, saying, when is he going to stop? If anybody had seen the movie by Mel Gibson, for instance, that was very difficult to watch. It really was. So I think if you watch that movie and then read this paper, it gives you a greater appreciation as to really what a victim of crucifixion in those days were like. And I'm sorry to say, but all those people who still believe that Christ didn't die on the cross, they're fools. There's no other way to explain it. Well, that was crucifixion time. That was when Jesus died. So how do we come to any conclusion or any solution that this cloth that we call the Shroud of Turin today is really that cloth? What makes us believe that? How do we connect the dots? It has a long history behind it. So we have what we call known history. Known history meaning 1355 was the first time that we have documentation of the exposition of what they called the Shroud of Christ in Lille, France. We have in Constantinople what we know to be the burial cloth of Christ, which disappeared then in 1204 with the sack of Constantinople. We believe that that cloth that they knew to be the burial cloth of Christ in the 1100s was probably really the mandilion, which was the face of Christ that arrived from Edessa. So I'm going to show you why there's that connection. So there's something that in popular press is called the Mandylion conjecture. I don't like that term particularly, but you'll read it, which is really trying to connect the King Abgar story all the way through, from Abgar being historically contemporary of Jesus, all the way through to today. And so what makes historians and art critiques really talk about this? Well, the Mandylion, as you know, I happen to have an icon. Whoa, can't walk too far. An icon here, which is called the Holy Mandylion. Okay, not made by hands, acheropeta. And this, anyone who's Orthodox or has been in Orthodox Church has probably seen this. And so many people say, oh, well, yeah, that's Veronica's veil in the West. Well, not really. So there's a story behind this, and this icon actually depicts it. All these stories around here tell the story of, which come from apocryphal Gospels, which talk about Thaddeus or a guy having been approached by one of the servants of King Abgar V, who was from Edessa, Now, Edessa today is Turkey, Urfa, the town of Urfa. And Abgar had some disease. We don't know what it is. Some people think it may have been leprosy because his face was disfigured, etc. But he had heard of Jesus' miracle working and sent his servant Hanan, Ananias, he has many names, depends on which one you read, to go to Jesus and ask for a miracle, a cure, or to have Jesus come to me and cure me. So Hanan gets down there, and obviously Jesus is too busy for that. And there are two versions of this now. There's a letter written by Jesus to Abgar, or Hanan was trying to depict Christ's face, couldn't do it, and Jesus washed his face and wiped it with a cloth and gave it to Hanan and says, take this to your king. Okay, these are apocryphal stories. But nonetheless, when you look at our icons, we tell that story. So this is the typical mandilion. So you see it's a cloth with just a face and a halo. It's a disembodied head, actually. But we don't think of it that way when we really look at an Archiropede. We don't think of it as a disembodied head like it was someone who was beheaded, like we look at sometimes of icons of John the Baptist, that we may just see his head. So where is Edessa? Well, Edessa's up here. It's Antioch, it's Edessa, it's up here in Turkey. And so what happens? Well, Jesus died, was buried. Then we know that he was buried, cloths were used, etc. I'm going to skip a lot of this because it gets too long. But there are cloths mentioned in the Gospels, and there are cloths mentioned in other historical writings, which we don't always account for. And I can't reach that first icon there, but that one is typical icon of the myrrh bearers coming to the grave, and the angel shows them the cloths. And you see the wrappings of Christ, and then you see what looks like the one that would have been covering the head as separate. And it states that in our Gospels as well. So if the shroud is the burial cloth, then it would mean that it's the large cloth that we had seen depicted earlier. But there are the other little cloths, and we don't really know what fate they had, although there was a lot of stories about them. But we're not going to get into it here. But people want to equate this mandilion with Veronica, or Veronica's veil. So think about anything that touched the dead in Jesus' days, and even today with the Jews, makes you unclean, right? And so if, in fact, when the apostles ran to the tomb, John and Peter ran to the tomb and they saw these cloths, and they knew it meant something. They knew it meant resurrection. Not that somebody unraveled the cloth, stole Jesus' body, and took him somewhere and left the cloths like that. They knew it meant something different. What did they see? Well, we don't know. The gospel doesn't enlighten us on it. But, so what happened to those cloths? They just leave them there? Chances are no. But if they did take them, they were doing it at risk of being called unclean. So we just don't know what really happened. So a lot of this is going to be conjecture. And we know, why the silence? So why is nobody talking about it? Well, first of all, if you were to have housed anything like this, you would have been found out to be a Christian, you'd be done with. And there were images on it, and we know that by Mosaic law, an image was forbidden. And whoever is your enemy was going to destroy it along with anything else that you may have had as memorabilia of this individual who they considered a total madman. Because remember how Christians were viewed in the Roman world. They were crazies. They needed to be exterminated. They tolerated the Jews, but they did not tolerate the Christians. So that's why there was a lot of silence. But getting to the Abgar legend, though, you'll see that Abgar is always depicted with this cloth, which reminds us much of the mandilion. And we see very primitive frescoes depicting Christ's face that way. So I'm going to skip this here because this is way too much, and I know I'm running out of time. But so what did the ancient writers have to say about any of this anyway? So we see Eusebius. He speaks of Abgar's message to Jesus, but makes no mention of an image. And then you have the Nun Egeria. Anybody ever read that? That's actually a quite interesting book. She's from the 4th century. She's thought to be from Spain, and she was on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And she wrote her adventures, basically, and where she did and what she didn't do. And she was also passed through Edessa. And the bishop showed her statues of Abgar and his son Manu and recounts to her the letter from Jesus, but there was no mention of a cloth or of an image. Then you have the doctrine of Adai, or Thaddeus, which again is from the 400s, talking about Hanan, I was just mentioning it to you, who painted the likeness of Jesus with choice paints. So now it's no more a letter, now it's actually a painting of Jesus. So it starts to get a little confusing. And then we have another text, a Greek text from the 6th century, saying that, he washed himself, he wiped his face with it, and the image having been imprinted upon the linen, he gave it to Ananias. And then in the Mozarabic Rite, which exists today only in Toledo, Spain, this was an area of the Visigoths when they were brought to Orthodox Christianity. They had their own liturgy. And in there, they read, and you can see this in their prayer books even to today, that Peter ran with John into the tomb, saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. That's not from the Gospels. We don't, it doesn't say that they saw the imprint of the man. They said they saw the linens. And then Evagrius in the 500s gives an account of how the image was sent to Abgar and saved the city during the siege of Khosrow, the Persians. So this references from these ancient writers of either a letter from Jesus or an image from Jesus. They start to confound a little bit. So reasons can be why images were really not looked upon greatly is because of the whole iconoclastic idea amongst the Jews, particularly at that time, because don't forget, this is not the Muslim era yet. And so these are just examples as to why people would not want to be showing images very much. But Ian Wilson, who's written extensively on this topic, kind of gives us, this is kind of just a bullet points, if you would, that, well, whatever was carried to Abgar, and they talk about it later as being an image, it was done in this time frame more or less. And then it wasn't spoken about for the next 500 years until 525. Then all of a sudden, there appears in paintings, in frescoes, the image of this cloth with Christ's face on it, as we know as the mandilion. It was so beloved by the Christians. And don't forget, back in Edessa, back in the days, there was the whole Monophysite and Orthodox battles going on. They were constantly fighting over it. They made copies of it. And then they said, I have the real one, you have the real one. And that went on forever. It ended in Edessa. It was taken away, actually, to Constantinople in 944. At that point, the city of Edessa was in the hands of the Muslims. And so it was in hostile territory. So they did some bartering. They exchanged soldiers. They gave them money. And finally, the bishop, one of the Orthodox bishops of the city, was forced to give up the mandilion. And it was taken to Constantinople. It was transferred on August 15th, but because it was a feast day, the feast is remembered on the 16th, the day after the Dormition. What I find interesting is that our Orthodox books are loaded with prayers and hymns for this event. If you read from Vespers or Matins, you read the Stichira, it's amazing, and I actually have some here. Jump ahead, first time that the shroud appears in Western Europe is 1533, but we'll kind of go over that in a second. So what of this Acheropeta? Well, I just showed you the icons. We see the angel always pointing to the linens, and you see Peter and John here looking at the linens. However, early Christian art, the depiction of Christ was anything but what we would look at today and say, wow, that doesn't look like him. But this was the norm, okay? These are from the catacombs in Rome. This is from Ravenna. For those of you who have not been to Ravenna, it is the city with the most intact Byzantine mosaics. Never destroyed by iconoclasts, but it was the Western Byzantine capital, if you would. And what does Christ look like here? He looks like a boy. No beard, pretty young. Here's the Good Shepherd depicted in one of the catacombs. Here he is with the Hemarisa, or the woman who had the bleeding. This is from the baptistry of the Arians, as they so call it in Ravenna. Christ looks like Apollo, for God's sakes. He really does. He looks like a Roman god or a Greek god. Then all of a sudden, this happens. Okay? This is from 200s, 300s. Come to the 6th century, the 500s, what do we have? This icon from Sinai, the Pantocrator. That face is dramatically different than how he was ever depicted prior. So here again, contrast. Do you see any similarities to this and that? Absolutely not. So what changed? What was the sea change in pictorial representation of Jesus? Here we have the Acheropita, Abgar. Here, this one actually, I must honestly say, I lived in Genoa. This is in the church San Bartolomeo degli Armeni, or San Bartolomeo of the Armenians. This icon here of the Acheropita was brought to Rome by Pope John, I think the 7th, who was Greek. He became Pope, and it was his personal possession. That is when Veronica's veil started. Because the story that went behind it by the Roman mind, now the Western Church, didn't have the Acheropita to really look at from Constantinople. And so the story of Veronica grew and diverged from the real Veronica story, because we're going to go into that. This is the Veronica that you would see in Western art here. One thing I want you to focus on here, this round face with this architecture around it, this trellis, more show and tell. So I reproduced the trellis here on cardboard, and obviously you're not going to see it back there, but it's the face of Christ in the middle, right? Okay. This is what came from Edessa. So, what happens over time? This is kind of outlining a little bit the time frame of what happened in Edessa, probably why the image was hidden. The story turned into a letter instead of an image. The image was walled up in the west gate of Edessa because Abgar became a Christian. His son who followed him became a Christian, but the son that followed that one reverted back to paganism and started to destroy Christian churches, etc. To conceal and hide this image, they put it in a niche in the western wall, the gate, the famous gate that was the main entrance into the city. And over time, forgotten because Christianity was persecuted, was no longer an official religion there, until a major flood occurred in the 500s, destroying 30% of the population was wiped out. And Justinian, the famous emperor of Constantinople who constructed Hagia Sophia, gave the monies to repair the city walls, etc. And it was thought at that time that it was discovered that was there. So now the Mandilion story is that they found the Holy Face of Christ walled up in this gate. In front of it was a candle still lit from the day that it was blocked up. And in front of it is called the keramion, which was a ceramic plate to cover it, in which when they took it off, it had a repeat image on it. That's the story that we get from history. But what it's telling us, though, that it was found again, and it was found in the early 500s. The Muslims gained control of this city, though, in the 600s. Iconoclastic period begins throughout the Byzantine Empire. So again, visual depictions were not very welcome. Icons were destroyed. And finally, in 943, General Kurkas, who, on behalf of the emperor, Romanos I, who was usurper emperor, he wanted to have the Mandylion in Constantinople, and he bartered at that time and got it. So one thing you need to notice here, where I'm getting to with this, is that when this was rediscovered again in the Western Wall, shortly after that, Christ started to be depicted as we see as the Pantocrator from Sinai. There was a sea change in the depiction of the face of Christ based on the fact that they rediscovered something that had been lost for almost 3 centuries, 4 centuries, to man's, knowledge. And so this is what we have. So now here the twist comes. I showed you what the Mandylion would look like from Edessa. And then all of a sudden, if I were to do this, I show you Christ rising from the tomb. Look at that icon on the bottom. What do we see? Okay, so the shroud, or the Mandylion, gets to Constantinople in 944. Iconography starts to shift. You see all of a sudden, this depiction of Christ standing there. And you'll see various verses. But what I find very intriguing about this particular icon is that you have the mandilion on top of it. This is telling a story. We go from this understanding to this understanding. So something happened when this reliquary got to Constantinople. Maybe the emperor decided, I want a better casing to put this in, or whatever the case may be, but they discovered that it was no longer just a face that was depicted, but it was a body. And there are actual writings of this. We have, so here is, again, just to stress the point of what you see, this to this, this to this. This actually is in my hometown in Italy. It's a fresco that dates from the 1400s. It's one of the rarer depictions in Western art of the extreme humility or the man of sorrows. But nonetheless, it is important because there's a development on iconography based on the finding of what the mandilion really was. So here's the changes that go on. So Vignon markings. So Paul Vignon was he was an anatomist. When he started looking at this in the early 1900s, he said, there's an awful lot of points of similarity from the face of the shroud to icons. Now, you know, those of you here know that icons are not painted willy-nilly. It's not up to the artist's interpretation of what he wants to put on the board. It's a copy of the original, so you don't lose nuances. So this is Shroud highlighting, and what you see of all these depictions of Christ with the dates of these various representations, here's the Sinai one, but you'll see that a lot of these things are not lost. So you'll see here, I'm not going to go through all of them, but that transverse streaks across the forehead, blah, 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 blah. There's lots of things that are picked up in iconography of the Pantocrator particularly, so which makes you think that the original artist who painted Christ Sinai had something to copy from. It wasn't willy-nilly that Christ's depictions changed from that young man Apollo-looking character to what we know as Christ today. So here is, again, a listing of those things. And this is the different places where Christ is represented. And you see from the 6th century onwards. And this is Sant'Apollinare in Nuovo in Ravenna. So this is even in Italy now, Christ is depicted as he was on the shroud. So very early on, that change came. And here's a superimposition, so you can see some contrast. It's not a big stretch of the imagination. The one thing that I really love, and I always find curious, is this fold in the neck on the shroud is depicted in that first icon. And here again, just to highlight some Vignon markings, this fresco no longer exists. It was destroyed. But nonetheless, this was a mandilion, and it had all the characteristics that they all have. So these are various depictions, but the one thing you will notice of the mandilion, you notice the trellis work repeated in many of these, and that's because that's how it was depicted in Edessa. Coins started to be produced with the visage of Christ on it as well. Before then, that was not something that was done. So the first one was Justinian II, the first known coinage of Christ's portrait on the obverse part of the coin, and even later Constantine VII in 920, 944, who was actually the emperor who was emperor at the time that the mandilion came to Constantinople after Romanus left, because Romanus was the usurper emperor at the time. So Mandilion saves Edessa from the Persian attack. And so this is from Evagrius. He describes how the image of Edessa was invoked to cause the Persian siege engine to be set on fire, repulsing the Persian attack. And this was obviously when, after the flooding, the city was repaired and the Mandilion was rediscovered. This is from an icon, a Russian icon, showing you the Mandilion being put in the wall, right, when the Edessans reverted back to paganism. And this is showing you later on, because it's like multiple pictures around one icon, shows you them holding the Mandilion there in front of the Persians, and they're escaping. So just the procession of the Mandilion alone was enough to cause the defeat of the Persians. So this is where we go. And so the Acts of the Apostle Thaddeus, who was one of probably the 70 disciples, was at the basis of this. So shroud is folded as mandilion as in 4, and we can see that's how it was probably put in a casing such as this. Now Veronica, interesting. I think it needs explanation, because if any of you here come from the Western Christian background, you're going to say, I'm dissing Veronica's veil. No, I'm not. What I'm saying is that it was an interpretation of the mandilion in some shape or form. Plus, the word Veronica means true icon or true image. But there's more to that story. It's not just a name given to a woman. Actually, there's a name Berenike or Berenike, which is a Macedonian origin name, which was used by both Egyptian and Jewish royalty. And I think in some verses you see it as Berenice, with the C instead of the K. And so you see that name appear multiple times. But it was used in the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is also known as the Acts of Pilate. But really in Western art, it began during the pontificate of John VII, who was Pope in the early 700s. From there, many copies were made throughout Western Europe called Veronica's veil. The translation from the Mandilion, though, as it's celebrated, these are actually from our services. And it shouldn't go unnoticed what we have to say about it, is that for it departed from the land of the infidel today and come to the imperial city, because obviously Edessa at that time was under Muslim control. And then further on say, the king of Edessa, acknowledging thee as the king of all, blah, blah, blah. So we recount in our own hymns this story. So what happened to the shroud, though? What happened to this image that was in Constantinople? Well, that infamous day of April 12th, 1204, when the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. Everything went missing, relics of all types. However, most of the relics were accounted for. The Venetians had it, the Romans had it, the Genoese had it, but nobody could account for the shroud. It's the one item that no one could account for. If anybody, have you been in Venice? Anybody been to Venice? Okay, you've been to the treasures. Where did all that stuff come from? Constantinople, including the horses. So when you really think about it, everything that is in Western Europe from that era was from the sacking of Constantinople and elsewhere. But the shroud, nobody knows what the heck happened to it. So, and even one of the knights, Robert de Clary, wrote in his journal that you can visit the church of St. Mary of Blackern, et cetera, and you could see our Lord being wrapped, which every Friday raised itself out so that you can see that it was of our Lord. And that was pretty much what he was talking about, was this here, the raising out. And interestingly enough, around that same time when you get to Constantinople is when you start to depict the epitaph the way we do today. You start to see it. This is an ivory carving. You start to see Christ laid out with the covering that's going to be laid over him. This is a shroud. This is written in English around it. This is pretty contemporary. But what's interesting is that the markings are from the shroud on here. The blood on the side, the scourge marks that you see, these red dots throughout, and also the swelling of the maxillary area, as well as that inverted 3 mark on the forehead. So this is quite interesting take on the representation. But the reality is, this type of epitaph was never really depicted before this point in history. And then you have people who witnessed this. So you have even Icelandic abbots who mention having seen the shroud with blood on it and his visit to Constantinople in early 1100s. This was the Praecodex that I said before, and you had that question, so how do I know it was the shroud? Well, here they're showing you washing the body with aloes, etc. And here is the angel. You see an angel here. When they come to bring it, he's showing them the cloth that Christ was buried in, and the burn marks are in here. As a matter of fact, these are the close-up of that. So it comes to show, so if this dating is correct here, which it probably is, then these burn marks preceded by several hundreds of years the burning in Chambéry. So the Constantinople device was an interesting thing. Really what it was talking about is how the shroud was lifted out of its casing to look like this. And so it was on a device. And the markings that you see here, see these lines going up and down, are the deep creases, and the way this must have been folded and encased in this apparatus that they had. Byzantines were very good at doing magical things. They'd have birds, mechanical birds flying around the place. It was very interesting what they were able to accomplish in those days. So they had this so that when you went on Friday, you would actually be able to witness Christ rising out of this box, casket, whatever it was, to show you up to the waist, which is why we have that depiction of Christ that we see standing the extreme humility. But there is the Oviedo cloth, which is in Oviedo, Spain, which is the head covering, okay, the one you see laid aside, which when you put those blood, and there's no image on it, it's purely blood stains and serum. It's a big mess to look at. But when it's overlaid on the head of the shroud, the back and the front, those blood stains match. And so that's thought, how it got there, nobody really knows. I mean, there's a lot of stories as to really how it got to Spain, but just like all the other reliquaries got to Western Europe, it probably found its way there. But if you were to just look at the Oviedo cloth, you wouldn't think much of it. It just looks like a blood-stained cloth. It's big, and unless somebody did the superimposition to the shroud, you wouldn't really know what it matched. But as far as other linens surviving, which have an image impressed on it, no matter how the image got there, like, as you said, with oils and whatnot, no. And, people have tried to reproduce this in their labs. We take a body, we smear it with X, Y, and Z, put the cloth on it, put it under such temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, you're going to get some kind of impression, but it's not this by a far shot. So, Gary, I think I've said enough.